In the rough-and-tumble world of the American West, saloons weren't just watering holes, they were the social heart of frontier life. Behind the swinging doors, cowboys, miners, travelers, and outlaws gathered to share stories, seek comfort, and enjoy the hearty dishes that kept the West moving. Tonight, we are stepping back into that world to explore 20 historic saloon foods that fed a nation built on grit, hunger, and hope. 1. Cowboy chuckwagon stew in the early days of the frontier. No sight was more comforting to a weary rider than the soft glow of a chuckwagon fire flickering across the prairie. Cowboy chuckwagon stew wasn't just a meal, it was a lifeline. Ladled steaming and heavy into tin bowls after long days spent herding cattle across miles of dust and silence. Most saloons in the 1800s West adopted their own version, borrowing from the recipes trail cooks created out of necessity, whatever scraps of beef they had. A handful of potatoes, onions, carrots, and sometimes even wild herbs found along the road. It was a dish without rules, but with one purpose: to fill the belly and warm the spirit. Men who had ridden hard from sunup to sundown found comfort in the stew's smoky scent, slow-simmered in iron pots that blackened from years of open-fire cooking. Each spoonful tasted of survival, of miles traveled, and of the camaraderie forged around late-night campfires. In many ways, this simple, rugged stew captured the heart of the American West, resourceful, rough-edged, and unforgettable to anyone who tasted it. 2. Buffalo hunter's roast. There was a time on the open plains when the silhouette of a buffalo herd meant everything: food, shelter, tools, and survival. And in the 1800s, saloons scattered across frontier towns, buffalo hunter's roast became one of the most prized meals a man could order. The dish often began long before it reached the saloon kitchen. Hunters spent days tracking the massive animals across the plains, risking harsh weather, long rides, and uncertain trails. When they brought in a successful haul, saloon keepers wasted no time preparing the prized meat. Thick cuts were rubbed with coarse salt, black pepper, and whatever wild herbs could be found, then placed over open flames or buried in coals, to slow roast for hours. The result was a meal unlike anything else in the West, deeply smoky, incredibly tender, and rich with the bold flavor of the frontier itself. Customers described the aroma as something that filled the whole saloon, drawing miners, cowboys, and drifters through the doors like moths to lantern light. For many, a plate of buffalo hunter's roast wasn't just dinner. It was a reminder of the vastness of the plains, of the fearless men who chased the herds, and of a world quickly changing as the Old West pushed toward modern times. 3. Salt pork and beans in the saloons of the Old West. Few dishes were as familiar or as dependable as a simple plate of salt pork and beans. It's the kind of meal that didn't pretend to be fancy. Instead, it spoke to the realities of frontier life: long days, hard work, and a hunger that needed to be satisfied without fuss. Salt pork was cheap. It lasted for months without spoiling, and it could be transported across deserts, mountains, and muddy mining trails with little more than a burlap sack. When cooked slowly with pinto beans or navy beans, it transformed into a warm, smoky, and deeply comforting dish that filled saloons from morning to sundown. Cowboys called it cowhand fuel. Miners ate it before heading deep underground. Travelers who had been riding for days would sit at rough wooden tables, grateful for anything hot, filling, and familiar. And saloon keepers loved it because it was reliable, no matter how wild the night became. They always had a pot simmering in the back. The dish wasn't glamorous, but it carried with it the taste of resilience, the flavor of a young nation still learning to survive on what it had. In a world where unpredictability was the norm, salt pork and beans offered a rare moment of steady comfort. 4. Sourdough skillet biscuits. Long before the West was settled with railroads and paved streets, there was one constant in nearly every frontier kitchen and saloon: a bubbling crock of sourdough starter, passed down from cook to cook like a treasured heirloom. From this living, breathing mixture came one of the West's most beloved comfort: sourdough skillet biscuits. These biscuits were more than just bread. They were the taste of home in a world that often felt unforgiving. Trail cooks kept the starter alive for years, sometimes decades, feeding it flour and water as carefully as they tended their horses. When the mixture was ready, they scooped it into cast iron skillets, letting it rise in the warmth of the saloon hearth before sliding it into the fire. The result was pure frontier magic: biscuits with a smoky crust, fluffy centers, and that unmistakable tang of true sourdough flavor that could only come from time, patience, and a cook who knew how to listen to the land. Cowboys tore them apart with calloused hands, spreading them with butter, molasses, or gravy from whatever stew was on the stove. Travelers raved about them, and for many lonely settlers, one warm biscuit was enough to bring back memories of kitchens they left behind thousands of miles away. Light, rustic, and a little wild sourdough skillet biscuits were a small comfort that made the frontier feel just a bit more like home. 5. Fried prairie chicken before trains and supply wagons made food predictable. Frontier cooks relied on whatever the land could offer, and more often than not, that meant prairie chicken. These wild birds, quick and clever on the open plains, soon became a saloon staple, especially in towns where settlers and cowboys wanted something hearty, hot, and unmistakably Western. Cooks cleaned the birds right behind the saloon kitchens, seasoned them with a simple mix of salt, pepper, and sometimes a pinch of sage, then dropped them into sizzling cast iron pans filled with bubbling lard. The aroma alone, rich, smoky, and faintly gamey, was enough to draw in hungry riders from the dusty streets outside. Unlike farm-raised chicken, prairie chicken had a firmer texture and deeper flavor. Every bite carried the taste of the wild, wind-swept grasses, long migrations, and untouched frontier terrain. Served with skillet potatoes, cornbread, or a ladle of thick gravy, it became one of the most satisfying meals a saloon could offer. For many travelers, fried prairie chicken was their first real introduction to the West's rugged flavors. And for the locals who lived on the edge of civilization, it was a reminder that the land still provided, if you knew where to look. 6. Gold Rush oyster stew in the roughest mining towns where muddy streets, loud saloons, and the clang of pickaxes marked everyday life. Oyster stew might seem like the last dish anyone would expect, yet during the Gold Rush era, it became one of the most surprising luxuries served in 1800s Western saloons. Barrels filled with fresh oysters were shipped in from the east and west coasts, packed in ice, and rushed across hundreds of miles by wagon, rail, or ship. When they finally arrived, saloon keepers treated them like precious treasure. A pot of creamy oyster stew simmering on the stove was a signal to prospectors that tonight's meal was something special. The dish began with butter melting in a pan, followed by onions, milk or cream when available, and a handful of plump oysters that cooked just long enough to release their delicate brine. The aroma was unmistakable, rich, ocean-kissed, and wildly out of place in a world of dust, gun smoke, and whiskey. Miners who had spent months digging through frozen ground for a few flakes of gold would crowd into the saloon for a taste. For them, oyster stew wasn't just food, it was a reminder of distant coasts, gentle tides, and civilization far beyond the mountains. A rare luxury in a harsh land, Gold Rush oyster stew became one of the Old West's most treasured and talked about dishes. 7. Frontier beef jerky strips long before modern convenience foods. Beef jerky was a lifeline for men living on the frontier. Saloon patrons didn't just eat it, they chewed on history, survival, and the rugged spirit of the West itself. Frontier cooks would slice beef thin, season it with salt, sometimes smoke it over open fires, and hang it to dry for days. The result was dense, salty, packed with protein of food, designed to withstand the long trails, sudden rides, and unpredictable journeys of cowboys, miners, and drifters. In saloons, beef jerky strips were often served alongside a shot of whiskey, a pairing that made the tough, chewy meat surprisingly flavorful and oddly comforting. They were eaten quietly at the bar, torn into small pieces between stories of cattle drives, mining claims, or last night's saloon brawl. The men of the West, these strips weren't just food, they were portable history. A reminder of the endurance it took to survive in a land that could be as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Every bite carried the taste of smoke, salt, and miles of open prairie. 8. Dutch oven pot roast. Few smells could fill a saloon the way a Dutch oven pot roast did in the 1800s West, as cowboys and miners spilled in from the cold. The rich aroma of slow-cooked beef and root vegetables promised comfort, warmth, and a temporary escape from the rugged realities outside. Saloon cooks relied on heavy cast-iron Dutch ovens, burying the meat in coals or simmering it low on the hearth for hours. Potatoes, carrots, onions, and herbs were added as available, turning a simple cut of beef into a hearty feast that could feed a dozen hungry men at a time. The slow cooking melted the meat until it practically fell apart, soaking the vegetables in its savory juices. For patrons, it wasn't just dinner. It was a ritual. The steam rising from the pot, the deep meaty aroma, and the knowledge that a warm plate awaited them made the saloon feel like a haven from a harsh, unpredictable world. Men would gather around, sharing tales of long rides, lost claims, and the day's small victories, while the pot roast quietly stitched them together with its rich, smoky flavors. In a land where sustenance often meant survival, the Dutch oven pot roast was both a meal and a celebration, a reminder that even in the toughest frontier towns, simple comforts could still be found. 9. High Plains ham and molasses, sweet, sticky, and irresistibly smoky. High Plains ham and molasses was a dish that brought a surprising touch of indulgence to the rugged saloons of the 1800s West. In towns where meat was precious and sugar even rarer, this combination felt like a small celebration on a plate. Saloon cooks would take thick slices of cured ham and sear them over open flames until the edges caramelized, then drizzled them generously with molasses brought in from distant ports. The result was a harmony of flavor: salt meeting sweetness, savory meeting sticky, that lingered long after the last bite. Cowboys returning from long drives, miners finishing grueling shifts, and drifters wandering through town would savor each mouthful, often paired with a cup of strong coffee or a shot of whiskey. It wasn't just food, it was a rare treat in a world where indulgence was fleeting, and comfort often came in small, sweet bites. High Plains ham and molasses captured the ingenuity and resourcefulness of frontier cooks, starting simple, preserved ingredients into a dish that felt luxurious, warming, and deeply satisfying in the heart of the Old West. 10. Sagebrush rabbit pie in the wide-open plains and rolling hills of the West. Frontier cooks learned to make every creature count. One of their cleverest creations was the sagebrush rabbit pie, a humble dish that transformed the simplest ingredients into a savory feast. Rabbits, abundant and quick to catch, were the star of this pie. The meat was slow-cooked with onions, wild herbs like sagebrush and thyme, and sometimes a few root vegetables, then tucked into a flaky, hand-rolled crust. Baked over a hearth or in a cast-iron skillet, the pie became a portable, hearty meal that could sustain cowboys. Hunters and travelers alike, saloons embraced it as comfort food. A steaming slice arrived at the table, its aroma filling the room with hints of the prairie, the woods, and a frontier life lived close to the land. For patrons, sagebrush rabbit pie wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. Every bite told a story of ingenuity, survival, and the quiet rewards of living off the land. In the dusty saloons of the 1800s West, this simple pie became a reminder that even the most modest ingredients could create something memorable, nourishing, and uniquely Western. 11 cast-iron cornbread slabs. Few dishes were as iconic in frontier saloons as cast-iron cornbread slabs. Thick, golden, and slightly smoky from the iron pans they were baked in. These slabs were more than just bread. They were a staple that could survive dust, rough handling, in a room full of hungry cowboys. Made from coarse cornmeal, a bit of flour, and water or milk when available, the cornbread was poured into preheated cast-iron skillets and baked directly over the hearth. The edges crisped beautifully, while the center stayed soft and hearty, a perfect vehicle for butter, honey, or savory stews. Cowhands and miners prized it for its practicality. It didn't just fill the stomach, it carried warmth and sustenance that could last all day on the trail or during long shifts in the mines. And in saloons, the aroma of fresh cornbread was irresistible, drawing patrons in from the cold, dusty streets. Cast-iron cornbread slabs weren't fancy, but they were essential, a symbol of frontier resilience and the simple comforts that made life in the Old West a little more bearable. 12. Smoked trout of the Rockies, high in the craggy peaks and rushing streams of the Rocky Mountains. Rivers teemed with trout, Frontier cooks knew how to turn them into smoked trout of the Rockies, a delicacy that brought the wild freshness of the mountains right into the smoky saloons of the West. Caught in icy streams and rivers, the trout were cleaned and carefully smoked over aromatic woods, often pine or juniper, which infused the fish with a fragrant, earthy flavor. The process preserved the fish for days, making it easy to serve to miners, cowboys, travelers who might be far from home and far from fresh supplies. Served on simple plates, sometimes accompanied by a slice of bread or a sprinkling of onions. The smoked trout became a reminder of the untamed beauty of the West. Patrons savored its smoky, delicate taste, which carried hints of the high mountain air and rushing waters where the fish were caught. For many, each bite of smoked trout of the Rockies was more than just a meal, it was a connection to the land itself. A fleeting taste of wilderness in a world slowly being tamed by settlement and saloon doors. 13. Pan-seared salted cod, even far from the coasts. The American West found ways to savor the flavors of the sea. Pan-seared salted cod became a staple in some frontier saloons, bringing a taste of distant oceans to the heart of the rugged plains and mining towns. Salted cod arrived, preserved, packed in barrels, and transported over long distances by wagon or rail. Saloon cooks would soak the fish to remove excess salt, then sear it in hot cast-iron pans, often with a splash of butter or rendered fat. The result was flaky, flavorful fish with a subtle briny temps that hinted at the coastal ports it had traveled from. Miners, cowboys, and townfolk appreciated its simplicity and reliability. A hot plate of cod could be served quickly and sustain men who had spent long hours on horseback, in mines or working the land. To them, the dish was more than nourishment. It was a reminder of the wider world beyond the frontier. In a saloon filled with the smell of whiskey, smoke, and stew, pan-seared, salted cod stood out as a taste of distant waters, a small reminder that even the Wild West could be connected to the rest of the world. 14. Trail bosses, chili bowl spicy, hearty, and packed with flavor. The Trail Boss' chili bowl was a dish built for men who lived hard and rode harder. In the dusty saloons of the 1800s West, a steaming bowl of chili wasn't just dinner, it was fuel, warmth, and a little piece of comfort after long days on the trail. Saloon cooks used whatever ingredients were available: chunks of beef, dried beans, onions, and a mix of chili peppers or paprika for heat. Everything simmered slowly in heavy pots, allowing the flavors to meld into a rich, fiery concoction that could satisfy even the hungriest cowhands. Often, a slice of cornbread or a few crackers accompanied the chili, perfect for soaking up the spicy juices. Men in the saloons would eat it hungrily, wiping their hands on rough napkins or coat sleeves, while sharing stories of cattle drives, gunfights, and long rides across the plains. The chili was more than a meal, it was a ritual, a dish that brought camaraderie to the table and fire to the belly. The Trail Boss's chili bowl captured the essence of frontier life: rugged, flavorful, and unpretentious, yet undeniably satisfying, a taste of the West in every spoonful. 15. Mountain man venison steak in the high country and dense forests of the frontier. Venison was a prized find, and nothing showcased the skill of a frontier cook quite like a mountain man venison steak. Lean, wild, and intensely flavorful, it became a staple in saloons catering to hunters, trappers, and rugged cowboys. The steak was typically cooked quickly over an open flame or in a sizzling cast-iron pan, preserving its natural juices and smoky aroma. A simple seasoning, salt, pepper, and sometimes wild herbs were all that was needed to highlight the rich, earthy taste of the meat. Served alongside potatoes, beans, or rustic bread, it was a meal that filled both stomachs and spirits. Patrons appreciated the dish not just for its flavor, but for the story it carried. Each bite spoke of long treks through forests, skillful tracking, and the resourcefulness needed to survive in untamed lands. A mountain man venison steak was more than a meal, it was a taste of adventure, a connection to the rugged land, and a reminder of life at the edge of civilization. In the saloon, amid smoke and laughter, the steak brought a moment of wild frontier life to the table, allowing men to savor the untamed West even while indoors. 16. Turkey neck soup. When frontier cooks needed to stretch every ingredient, turkey neck soup became a humble yet surprisingly rich dish in 1800 saloons. Cheap, flavorful, and nourishing. It was the kind of meal that could warm both the body and the spirit on cold plains or after long days on horseback. The soup was simple but clever. Turkey necks were simmered for hours with onions, carrots, herbs, and a few available root vegetables, releasing deep savory flavors into the broth. The meat itself, tender and infused with the rich stock, was served alongside hearty bread, making the dish filling and satisfying for anyone who walked through the saloon doors. Miners, cowboys, and wanderers alike appreciated its unpretentious comfort. In the bubbling cauldrons behind the bar, the soup quietly simmered, while patrons shared stories, played cards, or recounted their day's adventures. Every spoonful carried a taste of home, of patience, and of resourcefulness, hallmarks of frontier cooking. Turkey neck soup may have been a humble dish, but in a world where sustenance was survival, it stood as a reminder that even the simplest meals could be hearty, flavorful, and deeply comforting. 17. Pickled eggs at the bar in the bustling, smoky saloons of the Old West. Pickled eggs were a simple yet iconic snack that could be enjoyed with little fuss and plenty of whiskey. Stored in jars filled with vinegar, salt, and spices, these eggs were inexpensive, long-lasting, and surprisingly satisfying. Saloons often kept them on the bar, within easy reach of cowboys, miners, and drifters, looking for a quick bite between drinks or a late-night snack after a long ride. The tangy, sharp flavor paired perfectly with the strong, smoky whiskey that fueled many a frontier evening. Beyond taste, pickled eggs represented practicality in a harsh land. They could withstand heat, dust, and long storage, making them an ideal food for a frontier town with unpredictable supplies. Patrons admired them not just for their flavor, but for their resilience, much like the men who ate them. In a world full of rugged survival and uncertain days, a pickled egg at the bar was comfort in simplicity, salty, sour, and memorable taste of the West. 18. Liver and onions frontier style in the rough-and-tumble saloons of the 1800s West. Liver and onions was a dish that packed a punch both in flavor and in nutrition. Loved by ranchers, cowboys, and miners who needed protein to fuel long days. It was a simple yet hearty plate that often disappeared as quickly as it hit the table. Frontier cooks prepared the liver by slicing it thick and searing it in sizzling cast-iron pans, often with a generous portion of onions caramelized in the same fat. The result was a rich, savory dish with just enough sweetness from the onions to balance the bold, iron-heavy flavor of the liver. Served with bread or potatoes, it was a meal that satisfied hunger and provided lasting energy for demanding work. For those who braved the frontier, liver and onions wasn't a delicacy, it was a necessity. But the skillful preparation elevated it, making it one of the most respected dishes in many saloons. Each bite reminded patrons that in the West, even humble ingredients could be transformed into something memorable. In the smoky atmosphere of a saloon, the aroma of sizzling liver and onions became a beacon for hungry men, a smell that promised warmth, sustenance, and a moment of comfort in an often unforgiving land.